Hi everyone, welcome to the TriEssence martial art channel, and today we're going to talk about whether or not muscle training is bad for the development of internal power. Now this is a very important question for anyone that is actively trying to progress in the internal martial art training. However, it is not a question that is commonly asked, especially for people in the West. And I believe some of you, even watching this video or reading upon the title, might be wondering to yourself, why is this even a topic worth discussing, right? And that's quite frankly because in the West, a lot of times, suppose internal martial schools teach something that is not really internal, and often the masters don't have true internal skills, and as a result, they kind of blend muscle training with the instruction. And as a result, a lot of the people who thought they were doing internal martial arts, especially in the West, are actually doing a pseudo-external martial art that has internal label to it. So before we get into today's topic, let me first just briefly talk about the context so you can understand this question better. So while this might not be an important topic in the West, right, for anyone who have actually spent a lot of time in the Chinese martial arts community in China, such as myself, it should become obvious that majority of the Chinese internal masters, at least the one that I've come across throughout the years, and that is to say quite a lot of them. I mean, there might be one or two that I don't remember on top of my head, but everyone that I do remember visiting and discussing, they all uniformly agrees that muscle training is counterproductive for internal martial art. So while in the West, this might not be a question that people even ask about, in China, most internal masters would agree that you shouldn't do muscle training once you start internal martial art. And my own two masters, my Tai Chi master as well as my Wushu Tongbai master, they are both adamant on this regard. For example, when I asked my Tai Chi master as to why I can't do strength training or muscle training, his answer is that internal training is about using qi, you build it up, and then you gradually push open your skeleton joint. And in doing so, you extend your skeleton structure, and the real power needs to travel through the joint. And the more muscle training you do, the more you close out those joints, and as a result, you'll never be able to develop the correct internal power. And when I asked my Wushu Tongbai master, right, his explanation in a nutshell is that they are trying to go after a primitive type of power, that what they call pre-heaven power, and he perceives muscle training as post-heaven strength. And he believes that the more post-heaven strength you have, the less likely you'll be able to activate your pre-heaven internal power. So if someone who has a lot of muscular strength, they will have to lose all those muscular strengths before they can engage in the internal power, or what he calls the pre-heaven power, right? It's the power that you are born with without having muscle training. So it's almost like the idea that when a baby is born, there's not a lot of muscles, and at that point he has the pre-heaven power. But upon he picking up muscles, it changes. Obviously, this is scientifically untrue because babies have muscle tones as well, and we can never do any action without engaging in muscle. But what you can interpret his understanding more as in the more muscular strength you have, the more it impedes on your ability to find and use internal power, because muscular power would be something that you would default to use and not be able to discover something else. So that's his reason why when you're doing Wushu Tongbai, you can't engage in muscular training. And in fact, both my master, right, my Tai Chi master and Wushu Tongbai master, they will actively not teach a student if they find out that student actively engages in muscle training, for the simple reason that they believe it will be a waste of their time, right? If you're doing muscle training, you're not going to be able to progress in internal training, and therefore they will not waste their time teaching a student like that. So as you can see, and it's not just my two masters, right? Like I've visited and spoken to a very old Bagua master who passed away now, Tian Fang, as well as many others that I'm not going to list here, but they all have a very similar idea when it comes to this topic. So as you can see, that it's actually quite a big thing within the Chinese internal martial arts circle. And if you're one of those persons that has actually talked to me about this topic back in the days, right, a couple of years ago, you would have got the same answer from me because I got this answer from my masters who I trust in terms of internal training. So now that you might wonder, okay, now if this is such an element thing in internal martial art training and is uniformly agreed upon by most internal masters in China, then why am I even, discussing about this? Right, so the short answer is, ever since I started going back to university and studying psychology, I'm also exposed to the scientific method of systematic empiricism, right? The scientific method of understanding phenomena of this world. And once I started studying scientific method, it made me reflect upon a lot of the preconceptions, and maybe that what we perceive to be true is not actually true, and we require some degree of experimental testing to verify our preconceptions. I mean, Chinese culture is full of these preconceptions that doesn't stand up in front of scientific inquiry. I'll give you a few examples. For example, most Chinese people believe that drinking room temperature water or water from the fridge would likely cause running stomach, which is why, this might be very bizarre for Westerners, but Chinese people, almost most of the time, they would boil the water and they will heat up the water and they'll drink warm water, right? Like my parents, even in summer, they will not drink cold water. They believe that it's bad for your stomach, it's going to ruin your stomach, you're going to have diarrhea, all kind of nasty stuff. But, it actually scientifically isn't true, right? Drinking cold water or water from the fridge, especially in summer, it does not cause running stomach or other health risks unless you already have other predisposed health issues. Another example would be that Chinese people believe that when you are 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, and so forth at 12-year increments, that year where you are turning 12 or turning 24, etc., you are more prone to accidents, right? Bad luck will happen to you on those years, and therefore you have to wear red, whether it's clothing or socks or underwear, whatever. You have to wear red things to escape from bad luck. And again, there's no scientific basis of this type of belief, and therefore they are just superstition. So at some point it got me to start to think, like, right, if there's so many things that the Chinese people back in the days believed to be true, but turns out to be superstition, what evidence do I have on the fact that muscle training goes against internal progression? Now, if I've already, explained why my Tai Chi master and my Wushu Tongbai master believe muscle training is bad for internal powers progression. However, when I think about it a bit deeper, I realize that since the founder of Tai Chi as well as Wushu Tongbai, no one in the lineage actually tested this out. That saying, no one has been doing internal martial art, then went and do strength training or muscle training, and then discovered that, oh damn, they're losing progression or they're losing the internal power and they're not as good as they used to be. No one actually did that. They pretty much all was taught about that, and therefore they avoided muscle training like the plague. So even though this is believed to be true for generations, no one actually really tested it. Because of course, why would they, right? Why would you put your own training at risk in doing something, right? If your training is working and yielding results, great, right? Why do you have to test the thing that your master tell you not to do? But of course, that is not the right mind and spirit for scientists, and therefore I decided to challenge this preconception and see, does this belief hold any water? So firstly, I began with trying to understand why would internal masters since back in the days held this belief. That's to say, no one actually went and trained muscle and then lost the internal power as a consequence. So if that didn't happen, then where did this idea originate from? When looking through history, it's clear to see that internal martial art raised itself and branded itself in opposition to external martial art. And in order to stand out as a new type of training method, they kind of have to show differentiation, right? They can't do the same thing as external martial artists, and therefore they stress on their method of training, which isn't about muscle and strength training. Another thing to consider is around the time that internal martial art really flourished is around the end of Qing Dynasty, the beginning of Republic era, it's a time of turmoil and a time where foreign powers, whether it's Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and eventually Russia and Japan, has constantly invaded China. So Chinese people as a whole have very low self-esteem, and they try very hard to reignite the national pride. And the one imagery they commonly associated with the West is that they are muscle brutes, right? Because if you look at any traditional description about people that they fought with that are foreigners, they often describe them as foreign strongmen that can lift heavy weight and they're all of muscle. It's almost like in order to protect the national pride, they stereotype these foreigners into the idea that they are full of muscle but are very dumb, both mentally and agility-wise, and therefore is not a desired state to be for any real martial artist. And it is true that the type of people they were exposed to at the time were mostly strong men working for circuits. So they're not actually real boxers like some of the story has been told, but they're strong men. So those people's jobs to build muscle and lift either real weight or fake weight. It is for show. And that sort of built in the stereotypical imagery among Chinese martial artists that Western people train a lot of muscle but they're dumb. And in order to set us apart and make us feel better, we're gonna say that a lot of muscle is bad for you. We're gonna not rely on that. And because of this type of stereotypical prejudice, a lot of Chinese martial art masters, even till today, has held on to that outdated imagery of muscular strong men and lack the nuanced understanding that there are many spectrums of muscle training. Right? You have the strong man. Right, so strongman is more functional. You have the bodybuilder who just build muscle that looks nice. You have the average gym goers who have calisthenics. You have people who have MMA and modern combat sport. Like each discipline has a different type of muscle training, right? So that's also another reason why I start to doubt this preconception, because not all muscular training end with the same result. So if our ancestors looked at circus strong men and came to the conclusion that those muscles are bad for martial art training, it doesn't mean every other form of muscle training is also bad for martial training, especially for internal martial arts. So upon realizing at the source where this preconception originated from, it is not a well-rounded empirical understanding to how muscle training impede internal martial art training, so I decided to investigate this a bit further. Now, of course, both my Taiji master and Wushu Tongbei master have expressed why they think that muscle training is bad for internal martial arts. So I do have to take their understanding into consideration. So based on my understanding of the origin of this idea, plus what my master has taught me, I combine them together and my own understanding to internal martial arts. I derived at a hypothesis. To fully investigate whether muscle training is bad for internal martial art, we have to first define what is internal martial art, or rather what is internal power. Now, if you've been following my channel, it should be no surprise to you that I don't prescribe to the woo-woo chi power, magical force that flows through your body and hit people, across the yard. So I don't prescribe to that. I mean, I do admit that my own Taiji master still believes in that, but I see that as a relic from the old days where people don't have scientific understanding, and therefore that's how they explain the phenomenon. But everything he has been taught me, I could explain them through science and physics. So therefore, my definition of internal martial art, internal power, is based on the 4 fundamental forces of internal, which I've had multiple videos I've made in the past, so I'm not going to talk about it in depth here. But what it all boils down to is that internal martial art requires a specific range of motion that people who don't train internal martial art have no access to. For example, if you have a circular hand, which I've done in the past, you must be able to wrap your shoulder around yourself, right? So if you look from here, you have to be able to go around without turning the body. Whereas if your chest is flattened out like this, that is not correct for internal or for Tongbei, for example. Another example would be, right, if you want to do 专拳 from Xing Yi, you kind of have to be able to again, concave that chest, push that back, and be able to take that fist through the center of your body, right? If your chest is fixed in this form, and you do, your Zhuanquan from the side, that's also not good when it comes to the standard of internal martial art. And occasionally, I see these Western people who does Tongbei, they're so muscularly bound, their chest is fixed, right? They can't concave it, they can't hold their chest. When you do a P, do a P like this. So, the shoulder would rotate over there, but in Wushin Tongbei, we do a P, you still have to wrap forward, right? You have to be able to P like this and not like that. So range of motion is what actually limits people from doing internal mechanics correctly. Another one would be the spine, right? For example, if your spine is fixed and you do your stuff like that, you're not going to be able to use the rest of your body. Even if you try to lean forward, it's still superficial, right? What you have to do is you have to be able to bend your spine, have to concave your spine and straighten it, which is the key to the Dai family Xingyi, which then eventually got transferred over to Xingyi. But there's an idea of compression and expansion, and of course there's also the opening of the hips joint and so forth. So the point is, there are these pre-required range of motion, and it does seem that when people have excessive amount of muscle, it does impede them from being able to completing these motions. For example, right, while I was working on Warrior last year, I made a friend, Aaron, right, he's a good friend of mine. And on stage, some days we get really bored, and and he asked me to teach him some martial art. So for example, I taught him, basically Wushin Tongbei, right, circular hand. And he's a guy that goes to gym regularly, and I've realized that he can't do it. Because he's done a lot of bench press among other exercises, his chest is pretty rigid. There's a lot of chest muscles, and more importantly, his shoulder blade and it doesn't move. So his chest is like one piece here, and he has to do the circular hand, pivoting on the shoulder joint, right? Whereas we require the back to wrap around. So so there are these challenges, right? When I'm teaching someone who have well-developed muscles from the gym, it's going to be much harder for them to do things that require internal martial art. So that part is true. But then, that then brings me to the next query, which is, but what if someone does muscle training and don't impede on this range of motion? And that's how I arrived at my hypothesis, right? If internal power or internal mechanic is determined by your range of motion of your various joints, then if one were to engage in muscle strength training that don't impede on the range of motion, then in theory it stands to reason that such strength training should not impede internal training. And once I formulated this hypothesis, based on it I derived at a methodology. The method is quite simple. Basically for the past 10 months or so, more or less, I've been engaging myself in various types of strength and muscle training, ones that I picked out that I believe do not impede or limit the range of motion, right? For example, if you take weight and do those short rep pumping your bicep, I've seen people where their bicep is pumped so much and so short that the arm can't literally straighten up. The arm is kind of bent, like permanently bent like that. A big muscle here and the arm is bent. For example, if you have muscles like that, of course you're gonna have problems, in Tongbei or even in Tai Chi, because even though Tai Chi's arm is kind of bent, but you have to be able to straighten it to have an expanded force, right? Because the joint are actually stretching out, you just can't see it. But if your muscle is actually pulling you in, you won't be able to have that expanding force. So I pick exercises that I believe will not result me in having, extruded, shortened muscles that will impede on my range of motion. So naturally, I didn't do any weight training, I didn't go to the gym. I look around, for available options, and calisthenics actually, caught my eye. Because firstly, in calisthenics, they have some pretty insane strength training, right? Especially the planche hold. I mean, that is like mind-bogglingly crazy. They're able to hold the body horizontal just on 2 arms. but at the same time, they also value range of motion, right? They're not trying to actively pack muscles that limit the amount of stretch they can have. They actually want maximum stretch. You can see with the planche, the arm had to be completely straight. So just overall, it just seemed to be a good fit. So for the past 10 months, I basically has been doing a basic calisthenic training, from pull-up to tuck planche hold, to pseudo planche push-up, to typewriter push-up, among a lot of other things that I'm not going to list in detail here. So I basically picked out exercises that I believe would help me to improve my strength, especially my upper body strength, improve my muscular strength, but do not impede on my range of motion for internal mechanics. And in order to keep track and to measure whether I'm losing progression in my internal martial art, I've been periodically whacking my friends, such as Eric. And I did not tell any of them that I'm actually doing this experiment on myself in order to eliminate placebo effect, right? So you see, if I told them that I'm doing muscle training and but I want to see if I'm losing my potency in my internal mechanics, depending on their preconception of this situation, if they think that muscle training is bad for internal, that placebo effect might make them feel that I'm hitting them less powerful or I'm producing less internal power every time I test on them. If they believe the other way, then vice versa. So I don't want their confirmation bias to meddle with the result. Therefore, I didn't tell any of my friends that I'm actively engaging in strength training for the past 10 months. But periodically I'm doing my tone-based P on the arms, also doing yi quan's hu pu and a few yi quan punch, and the wu shi tong-based middle punch, and yi quan's fu an. So a couple of these things that I periodically try on them, eliminating placebo effect and to see am I actually losing my effectiveness, my internal power, or am I actually increasing it because I'm getting more strength in my body, or is it staying relatively the same? So after 10 months, the result seemed to be that the muscle training that I engage in did not actually affect my internal power or my internal mechanic. So basically Eric and my other friends were not being able to detect a visible difference in the previous mentioned type of internal power testing that I did upon them throughout the previous 10 months. But at the same time, muscle training also didn't improve these internal mechanics or the internal power that I'm able to produce. So it basically seemed to me that muscle training is independent of internal mechanic. When I think about this rationally, it does make sense because internal martial art uses a very different mechanic to conventional way of punching, right? So, for example, in yi quan, where you throw the front punch, you don't actually pull the punch back and extend it out. You kind of keep it here, and you use the expansion of different joints and the way your body and your feet and everything kind of push into one another to hit the punch. So what that means is you're not really relying on how much force your bicep or your tricep can generate. I'm not trying to push something out. It's kind of relatively independent of what my bicep and my tricep does. And that in internal martial art we call it skeleton structural force, because we basically hold a skeleton in place and we move the joints in order to hit. Right? Similar thing with wu xing tong based mid punch, right? For example, we don't kind of bend the arm. I've basically talked about this back in other video, right? So just quickly run down here. Instead of bending the arm and punching it out like that, which will require muscle strength on the bicep and the tricep, it's kind of place the arm here and uses the body to hit it out. So there's a very little extension of the elbow joint, which is why it does make sense that when I attain more muscle strength, it didn't actually improve the type of strikes, because the very mechanic itself, it kind of does not use muscular strength. And when you use muscular strength, you're kind of doing it wrong from internal mechanic perspective, right? So I'm not saying muscular strength is bad, I'm just saying that from an internal mechanic perspective, when you are relying on your bicep and tricep, you're probably doing it wrong. Which is why even though I've gained a sufficient amount of upper body strength and muscular power, right? For example, at the start of this experiment, I can't even do 1 pull-up, and now I can do about 11. So, you know, from 0 to 11, that's quite a huge improvement when it comes to, you know, to upper body and muscular strength. But that amount of improvement, it didn't show at all with stuff like P or mid punch or various 一拳 punch or even, you know, 俯按 among other kind of power generation. It didn't help them at all. But at the same time, it didn't impede on those mechanics either, because as I mentioned previously, I made sure that my training did not impede on the amount of range of motion I have on my joint. And since that most of these mechanics relies on an extended range of motion on different key joints, if they are not impeded, the muscle training shouldn't actually impede on my performance of internal mechanics. Okay, so now you might wonder, okay, now this is all good and well, but you know, what's the point of doing muscle training if it doesn't actually help with internal martial arts? Well, there are other reasons why you want to engage in muscle training, even if you are on the path and journey of practicing internal mechanic. For example, health is a very good reason that you should engage in muscle training. Obviously, if you're very young, it just don't really concern you, but as you get older, our body will start to lose calcium deposit in the bones. And doing muscle training, strength training, and resistance training is one of the best ways to teach or to basically tell your body to retain calcium in the bones. At the same time, it also, you know, tells the body to retain your muscle tone, right? Your body, once you get older, you know, 40 and up, it gets to a point where use it or lose it. So if you don't actively engage in muscle and strength training, you lose muscle tone, you lose, you know, proteins in your muscle, and you lose calcium, and those things are not good for your health. So from a health perspective, doing a degree of strength and resistance training is actually very beneficial, contrary to the traditional Chinese internal martial arts belief, where they think that, you know, if you're doing strength training, the older you get, the more damage you're going to do to your body. That's actually not true. Of course, if you train over your limit, you're going to get injured, which is true for anything. I mean, you can eat salt. If you eat too much, you get salt poison. If you drink water too much, you get water poison. So anything you do too much is bad. But a healthy dosage of strength training with or without weight is actually great for your health. Even if you're, you know, 60 or 70, depending on your health condition, you should engage in muscle training and strength training. So that's one reason why you might want to do internal martial art as well as muscle training. Another thing is, you know, to basically lose weight. Have you ever noticed a lot of these internal masters, they're all kind of, you know, overweight and on the borderline of obesity. Now, of course, I'm not trying to be prejudiced toward people suffering from obesity, but we have to recognize the fact that obesity is a health risk. And, you know, no matter what kind of story that those internal masters spin, which is usually about the belly is a chi deposit, the body is full of chi energy, that's why, you know, they're bloated. But the bottom line is, if any of them go and actually, you know, take a health examination, chances are they're going to have, you know, cardiovascular risk, they're going to have the high cholesterol, they're going to have like fatty liver, among other health risk issues. They're not healthy, right? If they're kind of overweight, that's not healthy. One of the reasons why a lot of internal masters are like that is precisely because they don't engage in muscle training. Of course, you know, diet and other habits are also important, but, you know, assuming that they control their diet, they might still have issues because they don't train muscle, so your body basically, you know, deposit more fat. You may or may not know that your muscles consume more calories than fat. So if you have a decent, you know, amount of mass on your body, then a lot of the daily calorie intake will be used up to maintain those muscles. So basically, a person, you know, same weight person who has more muscle would be able to consume more calorie and not let them grow into fat. So we can basically make a rough assumption that if two persons is about similar weight, the person with more muscle is probably healthier than the one that has less muscle and more fat ratio. And that's another reason why, you know, even if you are an internal practitioner, why you might want to do some degree of muscle training just to, you know, have some muscle to, you know, to use up the calorie and, you know, have less likely to be fat. And also, right, if you doing only internal training, especially Tai Chi, etc., it's actually quite hard to lose weight. I mean, obviously, if you control your diet, you can. Now, obviously, this is a complicated topic on its own, so I might make another video about this in the future. But in short, internal martial alone can't keep your body in shape, especially when you get older and your metabolism slows down. So, if you can supplement some degree of muscle training, it will actually help you to keep your body in shape. That's another reason why you might want to do muscle training. And, also, some people might just want to look better, in their clothing, that also can boost self-esteem. And some other people that I've spoken to, they just want to have some strength because, that's what they like. So that, when you go to shopping, you can, hold your grocery bags without, having backaches, for example. So having a degree of upper body strength is useful in everyday life. For example, there's this one Shanxi Mantis master that I know. He once told me that his master, which is pretty old now, he can't carry grocery bags, right? Whenever he goes to grocery, someone else have to carry it for him because he just don't have the strength to do so. And he can't move furniture around the house, even when he was younger, right? Not when he's old, but even at a younger age, he can't move furniture around because his body just don't have that type of strength. I mean, his master is great at internal martial art. Right? He can hit somebody and make them, fall back a couple meters. Very high skilled, but he can't engage in any daily activities that require a decent degree of strength. And and back then I used to think that is like what I should aim for. But now that I've gotten older and learned to think about things scientifically, I realize that's probably not what I want. And therefore, it's actually useful to have decent amount of strength just for everyday convenience. And lastly, I'd like to just discuss the limitations to this personal experiment that I engaged in. So firstly, if you have any formal scientific training, you should instantly recognize that I'm only a sample size of 1, which is not great for experiment. And unfortunately, that's all I could do, right? Martial art in itself is not a field that is actively engaging in scientific research, and and this is something that potentially can hinder my internal martial art training. So it's not something that I wanna force upon other people. I'd rather mess up my own training than mess up somebody else's training. So that's why I can only engage this, with myself with a sample size of 1, and it's not great. So my ability to generalize this is very limited based on my own experience. However, the principle of why I arrived at the result I arrived at, it makes sense, right? And scientifically, there is this notion that if you don't have enough sample size, or you cannot control your experiment with control group and experimental group, due to various ethical reasons and other reasons, then you do have to look at, does the conclusion make sense? Is the causation, no relationship clear? And so basically you try to look at it rationally and see if it makes sense. And and if I look at the fact that even if internal mechanic is range of motion, my muscle training didn't impede the range of motion, and therefore it didn't impede my internal ability, it makes logical sense. So that's why I do think this is somewhat generalizable, although the sample size is very limited. So that's the first thing you should take note, is that sample size is not great for a scientific experiment. Secondly, what I engage in is what we can call a case study, right? Although I'm studying myself, so it's actually not good. Usually you want to study somebody else to take away personal bias. I've set my experiment in a way that I remove most of my personal bias, for example, by testing my power on somebody else who doesn't actually know what I'm trying to test. And therefore, it can eliminate a degree of personal bias, but we can never fully eliminate personal bias. So that's another thing to take into consideration. Ideally, you want someone else to administrate the experiment with the test subject, not be the one that is actually running the experiment. And also, right, case study ranks pretty low on the hierarchy of evidence, right? So if you look at the triangle of evidence, at the top we have systematic review and meta-analysis, we have random control trial, we have cohort study, we have case control trial, then we have case series study. So and below that is where I'm at, is case study. However, it's still better than eminence explanation, right? Which is basically asking an expert. So expert opinion actually ranks lower than a case study. And in this case, the eminent evidence would be, what my masters and other, internal masters say from the past. That's basically an expert opinion, which is not as strong as the evidence as a case study. So what I did is slightly better than, than hearing it from my masters. But it's nowhere near as good as all the other ones, in this empirical evidence hierarchy. And unfortunately, it's just not possible to conduct this experiment, nor do I think it is worth the investment financially and timely to actually do a formal study like that. So this is the best I can do, and and I hope that this will serve as indication for any of you that are curious about this topic. Another thing I would like to address is confounding variables. So in the scientific research, confounding variables are basically variables that that is not what we are trying to test for, but may still influence the testing result. And when it comes to muscle and and power output, one common confounding variable that people would inevitably run into is the increase of body weight. So for example, if a person did internal martial art and also did muscle training, if he actually put on weight, he might actually in the end of the day produce more internal power output when he tested, but that output does not actually come from his increased muscular strength, but rather come from the fact that he has an overall increase in body weight, because internal martial art heavily leans towards the ability to unify your body weight and throw the body weight onto your opponent, right? Force equals MA, mass times acceleration. So by increasing body weight, you increase your power output for both internal mechanic as well as external muscular power. So therefore, that's a potential confounding variable. And for myself, I control this variable by basically not increasing my body weight. So throughout this period, I basically measure my own body weight and control my diet to ensure that my body weight is not increasing because I'm packing on muscle, and obviously it's not decreasing. Because usually, right, if you pack on muscle, you tend to eat more calorie, and the calorie will convert to muscle, you get muscular strength. So I basically control the amount of calorie intake I do, so my body weight remains more or less the same, to basically eliminate this potential confounding variable. However, something that I could not test for is whether or not the sequence makes a difference, right? So what I mean by that is, so I'm coming from a place where I've already done decades of internal martial art training. I've unlocked the range of motion and internal mechanics, and I do more or less all the mechanics that my master has taught me. And then I am doing muscle training. So it's someone who's already done sufficient amount of internal martial art and mechanic, who then engage in muscular training. And I know what kind of range of motion that I want to keep, and therefore when I do my muscle training, I avoid exercises that basically impede upon it. It is unclear if someone who have never done any internal martial art training, who then first did muscle training and packed down muscles, and then engage in internal martial art mechanical training, will it be actually harder for them to reach the desired internal mechanic because they've first put on muscle, right? That's something that I cannot test for, and therefore I cannot actually give an answer for. Or alternatively, if a person without any prior training at the same time does internal as well as muscle training, right? Would in that case the muscle training impede on their progression in internal training? I'm not sure either, because in that case, at one end they're struggling to, for example, open up their shoulder and shoulder blade joint, but at the same time they're engaging in muscle training that kind of potentially could confine the range of motion for the muscles, although I don't think calisthenics does. But I can't say for sure because that's not the sequence that I've engaged in this experiment. So those are the two sequences, right? Whether you engage in muscle training and then internal, or internal and muscle training together. Those are the two scenarios I cannot test for and I cannot answer for. Those are the limitations of my little personal experiments. So other than that, the past 10 months at least indicated to myself, right? I can't really say this is enough empirical evidence to put this matter to rest. But at least to myself, I now believe that the correct amount of strength and muscular training does not impede on my progression of internal martial art. Alright, so I hope that this video has made sense to you and and has shed some new light on any of you out there that that were told that if you do internal training, you shouldn't actively engage in strength training. And if you find this video interesting, do subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you can support my Patreon channel, that would be greatly appreciated. I have an entire list of Patreon exclusive video where I go through various internal mechanics using scientific method, with this explanation of 一拳or 无形通背 or Tai Chi. So if you want to improve your understanding of internal martial art and its mechanic through scientific understanding, then definitely do consider subscribing to my Patreon channel. Lastly, I would like to give a shout out to all Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for your support. And special shout out to my new Patreon supporter, Darren Pickford. And welcome back an old Patreon supporter, Slade. Thank you guys for joining my Patreon family. And as always, if you have any questions on current content, as well as suggestions for future content, always feel free to message me and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you guys for watching TriEssence Martial Art channel, and I will see you next time.